No matter how Donald Trump might like to frame it, much of the rest of the world saw a costly disaster in Iran. But what did China see? Did they see David's strength in defence or Goliath's inability to attack? We're talking about China's ambition in Taiwan. Did the American and Israeli war on Iran make it more or less likely China would invade, blockade, or do what exactly in relation to Taiwan?
My fear right now is that Beijing could look at the situation and conclude that the Americans are simply overwhelmed or incapable of achieving their objectives. I think that would be a very dangerous miscalculation, but that's not one that we can certainly rule out.
Did China also see a superpower losing its reputation as an unstoppable force that could enforce its will over a smaller opponent? I'm asking an overqualified expert today who's been living in Taiwan for 20 years.
My name is J. Michael Cole. I'm a Taipei-based senior fellow with the Global Taiwan Institute, with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and a research fellow with the Prospect Foundation.
Michael is also a former intelligence officer who recently published a book titled The Taiwan Tinderbox, the island nation at the centre of the new Cold War. A great resource for us on this matter. So a great person to ask, what did China learn from the US-Israeli conflict with Iran?
I think one of the key lessons that China may have gotten from the recent experience in Iran is that even the world's most powerful military, if it is facing off against a country that has been preparing for many years for these types of contingencies, it's never going to be easy. There's going to be a lot of unknowns and a lot of unexpected developments. And if I were Beijing and had assumed that perhaps taking military action against Taiwan would be a walk in the park, if I'm in Beijing, I'm going to be thinking twice that, okay, there might be, different things that we simply did not expect, especially if you're facing off against someone that is not only prepared, but dedicated and does not want to give in. That could mean that a conflict that initially was believed to be short-lived would become, in fact, protracted and a lot more complicated to terminate.
So the Americans chose when to begin the war, but it was a messy and complicated end. And on what terms? We still don't really know if it has effectively ended. But the million or billion-dollar question here is, did China see enough to make them rethink their ambitions to re-unify Taiwan with the Chinese mainland?
We can certainly hope that this is the lessons that Beijing is learning. Not only recent American travails in the Middle East, but also a few years earlier. I mean, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Decision makers in Moscow also expected that they would be in Kyiv within 3 days. And look now, this has been more than 3 years, and they're still they're not making the kind of progress that they were hoping to make. So if I were Beijing again, I would look at what happened in Iran. A formidable military assisted by the strongest military in the Middle East, taking on a entrenched, well-prepared government that does not have as formidable a military as the Americans do. And yet, in my view, it's very clear that the United States were not able to achieve the objectives that President Trump has set up for his country. So now, if you contrast that with Beijing's intentions towards Taiwan, I think those two lessons would compel a leadership in Beijing to think twice about embarking on that kind of adventurism, especially at a time when Taipei, in coordination with allies, particularly the Americans, are also learning and applying the lessons from the wars in Ukraine and in Iraq, in Iran. So, emphasis on drones, asymmetrical capabilities, hardening targets, and certainly complicating the PLA Navy's operations in the Taiwan Strait, just as we saw in the Strait of Hormuz in the Iran contingency.
Right, so Michael led me here, so let's jump into the deep end, the pragmatic end, and talk about the correlation between the Strait of Hormuz. By now we can clearly see that thumbnail in our minds. We saw it a million times, and rightly so, because when shipping stopped, oil stopped, and everything got more expensive for pretty much everyone. So did the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz and all of its side effects, the massive economic cost, did that do more to potentially deter China from risking anything like that around the Strait of Taiwan?
Well, I would argue that much more than Ukraine, the Strait of Hormuz had made it clear that in the modern age and in the globalized world, no armed conflict would occur in a vacuum. It's not isolated. And as I said earlier, the global economy is much more reliant upon and exposed to an open and free Taiwan Strait than the Strait of Hormuz. And we already saw the cascading repercussions of conflict in the Middle East. It would be by orders of magnitude much more severe if there were to be armed conflict in the Taiwan Strait, or even just a quarantine or a blockade. So, if I were in Beijing, knowing this, I would fully expect that United States, Japan, and other major economies would also intervene. And I like to think that, or I would argue that ultimately this all, in the aggregate, contributes to greater deterrence against China making that kind of decision and taking military action in the Taiwan Strait. Obviously, that assumes rational decision making. If for different reasons or certain conditions, potentially domestically, the Chinese regime felt that it has no choice but to do the unthinkable and act in ways that to us would seem irrational, then obviously all that deterrence goes out the window and is seriously undermined. So we're always assuming and hoping for rational decision making in the capitals of countries that have the potential to start major wars.
So the Chinese lens is critical, the Chinese viewpoint. But as we use Michael's deep knowledge and understanding, it's right here that we have to flip the perspective, I think. We can clearly see why perhaps China would maybe lose belief that they could take Taiwan by force or justify its cost. But what about the Taiwan perspective? Chinese propaganda wants Taiwan to believe that resistance is useless. But is there a world where the Iran war didn't just deter China, but they show Taiwan that resistance against a bigger opponent can work, that a much smaller opponent can hold off a superpower?
I think that this is certainly one of the conclusions that you could expect Taipei to have reached from what we saw in recent developments. And again, if you look at Iran capabilities compared to Americans, and then Chinese against Taiwan, there's a huge power imbalance. And yet, on this occasion, the smaller party in that conflict was able to put up a strong defense by oftentimes thinking outside the box and exploiting the weaknesses of their much stronger adversary. So this is certainly something that Taiwan also could learn from that experience, exploiting its own capabilities, exploiting its geography. Certainly, the Taiwan Strait presents a formidably challenging environment to launch a military operations against the well-defended island. So in my view, again, with Taipei paying very close attention to what's going on in Ukraine and in the Middle East, it gives me hope that on paper, a smaller military with a population that is also committed to defending their territory could certainly complicate the lives of a stronger opponent, at least on paper.
Right, so we've just heard about how Taiwan might be buoyed by Iran's use of drones and their use of hybrid warfare against an opponent that, on paper, that is many times its size and strength. So let's talk about where it might go from here. With all of that in mind, what's the best case scenario for Taiwan?
Well, continuation of the status quo and de facto independence. I mean, Taiwan, its official name is Republic of China. It's mostly known around the world as Taiwan. For all intents and purposes, it is an independent state. It does not get full diplomatic recognition from most of the international community, but it does have functional, relationships which almost every single country around the world. It has its currency, its ability to conduct foreign affairs, it has its military, has its democracy, its voting system, and a very vibrant industry and all that. So continuation of the way things are right now is probably the most feasible scenario for the foreseeable future, as long as it and its allies continue to retain the ability to deter a Chinese decision to use force against it. Of course, the optimal scenario would be for enlightened Chinese leadership at some point in future, realizing that the two societies are simply not compatible enough to be able to manufacture the kind of annexation or unification that they've been dreaming of and talking about in their propaganda for decades. But I don't expect that we're going to see that kind of leadership emerge anytime soon in Beijing.
So then, under this current leadership, no midterm election, no long-term election to worry about. I didn't particularly want to end here, but it must be considered. After all of what has happened in Iran, what does J. Michael Cole think is the worst-case scenario for Taiwan, for China, and the world?
Evidently, worst-case scenario would be the Chinese side to look at the geopolitical environment and conclude that it now has the capabilities and the occasion to try to resolve the Taiwan quote-unquote issue through use of force, and would initiate a amphibious assault against Taiwan to resolve that by force. That is the ultimate decision that would be taken by Chinese regime. I doubt that this is how they hope to resolve the issue, because there are too many unknowns. They have not fought a major war since 1979, arguably, against Vietnam, so they do not have the experience, let alone the practice and potentially the capabilities to initiate something against a, military action against a well-entrenched, well-prepared opponent that would also very likely receive assistance from outside militaries, chief among them the United States. What worries me would be lesser types of conflicts, something like a quarantine or naval blockade, that increases the risks of miscalculation, of accidents, that could then quickly escalate. And again, having no practice of waging modern armed conflict, we simply do not know how the PLA chain of command would react if there were to be a collision or something of that sort. And my fear then is that, combined with nationalism on the Chinese side and a strong dose of disinformation, I fear that the Chinese Communist Party could then feel it has no choice but to escalate. Otherwise, it would suffer, a huge reputational hit back home, having presented itself as the political party that is capable of achieving the reunification of Taiwan. So escalation, major conflict, but not by design, is something that I think should wake us up in the middle of the night and have us worried more than Xi Jinping himself one day deciding to initiate amphibious assault against Taiwan.
It's somewhat of a bleak note to end on, but I think what J. Michael Cole did for us was articulate and illustrate just how tricky the next steps might be, no matter who takes them and in what direction. What will China do? Could Taiwan really perform the type of rearguard action that we saw from Iran? They are questions for you. A penny for your thoughts, your comments as well, as we say goodbye for now.